joining us, and thank you to all the speakers in this session. Each presentation is approximately 10 minutes long, and even though they are pre-recorded, most of the speakers are here with us live to answer your questions and respond to comments. Please direct all questions to the speakers using the Q&A feature found at the bottom of the webinar Zoom panel. Please direct all questions to the chat, or not to the chat, to the Q&A feature. Please ask questions during the presentation, and the presenters can answer them in text during the presentation or during the 3-minute Q&A period at the end of the presentation. The chat function has been made available for technical problems or for conversing with other attendees. Please use this judiciously, as any nefarious or inappropriate use of the chat will result in you being removed from this meeting or the chat function being disabled. As the attendees of the 2020 virtual conference, ECN's code of conduct applies to virtual events as well, and you can find that using the QR code right there, as well as other links I'm sure will be put in the chat as well. If you haven't already, please change your name to reflect your name and institution. You can do this by completely logging out of Zoom and doing that using Zoom's actual settings. I know there was some confusion about in the first session, but you don't have to do that right now. You can wait to do that later. There will be a break from 21:30 to 22:30 UTC. I just want to thank the officers of ECN for supporting the symposium, as well as all the presenters in the symposium who spent so much time putting together the presentations. Both Oliver and I thought it was important to have a symposium discussing and dealing with the past and current effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, both as a way of sharing ideas and to process what we've lost this year. I hope that this symposium promotes good discussion and community during a difficult time. While we are not having a dedicated meet and greet after the symposium, we hope you will ask questions of the presenters and share your experiences dealing with the pandemic in the shared Google document, the link of which is in the chat, again, right here, as well as accessible for you at that QR code and at that link that is up on the screen right now. So enjoy the symposium, and we look forward to connecting with everyone during the social hours. Our moderators will now start the first presentation. Our first presentation is, let me stop sharing here. Our first presentation is Zoe Simmons. Zoe, if you could please, there you go. Zoe Simmons from, let me get my notes up here, and I'll let her speak for herself.
So currently the collections project lead for the Hope for the Future project, which is what I'm here to talk to you about today. It's a large project, so I'll do my best to squidge it all in 10 minutes. Just to give you some context, this is the museum back in the day, opened in 1860 with a very large bequest of entomology collection, which we've been building on ever since. We have about 5 million specimens in the collections nowadays. Around 1 million of those are British. The Hope for the Future project is just British insects that we're talking about, but we did decide we would go all in, and it is all 1 million insects that we are trying to deal with this project. So this is the project. It's named Hope for the Future. Hope, Reverend Hope, was our initial donor who established the department. It also gave us this lovely little acronym that we can use. So we have HOPE, which stands for Heritage, Outreach and Preservation of Entomology. And those are the 3 strands of work that this project encompasses, and I'll go through each of those in a moment. We are in a 3-year delivery phase. We're about a year through, although of course timelines are slightly stretchy at the moment, so that doesn't really mean anything. It's a £1.3 million funded project. It's the biggest project the museum has ever had. £700,000 of that has come from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. It was quite something to go through that process. It was a big grant to get in the first place. So it's quite an exciting project for the museum all round, to be honest. So to go through the strands, heritage obviously encompasses the British entomology collections themselves, but it also covers this room that I'm currently sat in. This is the site of the original entomology collections. It's one of the best decorated rooms in the museum. We're very famous for having a lot of pre-Raphaelite influence in our museum. Unfortunately, sometimes in the sort of 40s, 50s, I think, somebody came in here with a tin of magnolia paint and thought that it would be a really good idea to make everything a different colour. So it will be, as part of this project, restored and conserved back to its original decoration, and then we will get this beautiful flexible teaching space out of it. So the room will be refurbished so that it can be used for all kinds of events. It will be a hireable space for the museum, obviously, but it will also allow staff within the museum to do a lot of outreach and engagement and teaching on the collections themselves, but also engagement with those external groups that might want to come in and use the space as well. So we'll be able to facilitate a lot of things, which is going to be super exciting, and I'm really looking forward to. The outreach portion of the project has its own strand. We have our own learning team that are associated with it. The collections team do have some engagement to do as well. We have a number of events where we were taking the collections out. Obviously, these are on pause at the moment, but we did get a few in before we went into lockdown. They're really about opening up the collections to anyone and everyone. So we tried to stagger them at different times of day and different periods during the week and things, get all the collections out. But we also included an element of sort of have a go. So we had some collections that people could sit down and put a label on and actually move and feel like they participated in the project. We branded that under Move a Million, and then your participant could be 1 in a million, which was really nice. We thought that was quite smart of us. We also had a huge volunteer cohort that were helping out with this. So we'd done a project just previous to delivery where they were counting. So we had Count a Million, and people went through and counted up all our specimens and listed the species. Part of that cohort and a massive new recruitment was just underway before lockdown, where we were going to get people in teams to come in and actually work on the collections. And I should say that the engagement with volunteers for us wasn't about numbers, it was really about depth of engagement. So we were really looking forward to having some people in repeatedly over a series of weeks where we'd actually do some teaching and give them some skills that they could take away and actually give them, you know, some interest and background in the specimens and talk about the collections and about the species and all these kinds of things. So it was really going to be quite an engagement piece that we were looking forward to. We're hoping that we're going to be able to do that, but at the moment we're not able to deliver that face-to-face teaching on the scale that we were looking at doing previously. So that is currently underway to see how we're going to remodel that. The preservation of entomology will be very familiar for most of you. We had all the normal problems that you find in entomology collections. The one thing that's perhaps a little different is that our British collection does have a lot of naphthalene, old historic naphthalene in cells around the edges of the drawers. Some of that naphthalene was starting to sublimate into the drawers and onto the specimens themselves. The smell is still quite overpowering, so we are having to do all of our work in a fume cupboard, which is obviously a little limiting in itself. But we have been able to get huge amounts of new furniture as part of this project. So it's all going to be modern, sector standard. We've got metal cabinets, new drawers, unit trays. You can see me cuddling the drawers. I was so excited when they turned up. Honestly, it was just amazing. And it's going to revolutionize how we can use this collection and what we can do with it. So the collections portion of the project really stops once all the stuff's been moved, but equally doesn't stop because we're now going to be able to do all those exciting things we couldn't do previously with its format. Obviously, with all this project, we've got everybody wound up. We were all going, very excited for all of our outcomes. We were looking at all our deliverables, looking forward to coming up for some big outreach and engagement sessions. And then lockdown happened just as, you know, fieldwork period started and this kind of thing, unfortunately. So we went into home working from March 23rd. We had about a week's grace between the UK being put into lockdown and the museum saying to staff, you have to work from home, which allowed us to photograph a lot of the collections, which was really useful. So they did about 5 weeks of home working, where they were just typing up labels from images from the collections, which was something of a slog. So hats off again. I always say this to them. I think they did an amazing job during that time period. And then we put them on furlough. The learning officers, unfortunately, we were not able to furlough because they'd only just started in March on their contracts. So we weren't able to put them in through the furlough scheme, and they had to work from home at a distance from the collections. They didn't know the collections. They didn't have access to any of the staff, to the museum or anything like this. So the learning officers really had quite a hard time of it, actually. And they're still sort of in slight recovery mode from that. They were able to pivot some of their work online, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And they did a really good job of it. But I think that disconnect between our learning officers and our collections is actually, it's still dragging on a little bit. We're almost there with them and back up to speed and getting everybody integrated again. We were quite lucky that the university deemed the project of special importance, so the team were able to return earlier than other staff members. So come July 1st, we had special dispensation to get them back in as a little bubble by themselves. So the collections move portion of the project was able to pick up from there. But obviously there was a lot of bad stuff that happened during that time. It slid all of our timelines, everything. So we didn't get our cabinets, which were, to be honest, already overdue before we went into lockdown, but the factory that was making them moved over to supplying goods for the NHS, and we missed our time slot in the factory. We've only just got to a point now where we have cabinets in place that we can put the collections in. It has been a real bottleneck for us. You can see that I'm surrounded by stacks of drawers. We are waiting on these cabinets any day now. They're going to be here and we'll be able to move our stuff into them. We lost all of our field work and our engagement, our outdoor engagement. As I said, the volunteering got a lot harder. Fundraising also got a lot harder. So we do have some fundraising targets that we need to match. And that's going to be a real challenge for us over the next few months. As part of the project, we had 2 apprentice positions that we were advertising. We now won't be recruiting on the second one. We had some problems recruiting the first time round, and it's now too late to recruit the second one as part of this project. So we were missing out on an apprentice, which is upsetting actually, because that was a really exciting part of the project that we hadn't seen in other places before. We still do have this bit of this disconnect between the team, as I was saying, but the big thing that's been a struggle has been mental health and well-being for staff members. We took a big project, we wound everybody up, we set them going, and then we sent them home. And that's been tough for everybody to overcome that as a challenge actually. So the good news, because there is good news, which is nice, is that those labels that they managed to get typed during lockdown have set us up in good stead. So they were able to come back, pick things up and really get going. And they bounced amazingly, all things considered, which was really nice. Our drawer companies didn't go bankrupt. So all of our drawers are now ahead of schedule for their delivery, which is fantastic. And we've been able to pivot staff within the museum. So front of house staff have been coming up and helped making new trays. We had some people, so on the events team, that have had some extra free time because we're not getting the events in the museum. And we've been able to train them up, and they've been helping us out with the collections and this kind of thing, which has been fantastic. And we've also been able to buy a little bit more equipment from the COVID black hole budget, as we like to call it, that has meant we can all do individual working. We're not sharing any equipment anymore, so people can just get on with things, which is really good. The outreach pivoted really well. The learning officers did an amazing job. They found their niche in delivering school resources that those schools were in turn able to push out for homeschooling. So we actually had reasonable engagement levels with this, despite the fact that on the face of it, being in lockdown and not being able to get into schools would almost have killed that portion of the project. So they've done some amazing work, and they've really set themselves up ready for this next school year that we're just into now, to be able to work with those. And we've been able to do a lot of that pivoting to move the other activities. So we took the learning that the learning officers did, and we've applied it to other engagement activities that we had coming up that were going to service a lot of other audiences, including a lot of adult audiences, which is quite nice. Volunteers are our next challenge, and we're going to try and get them involved in some of these things going forwards as well, because we have a big volunteer culture here and we don't want to leave them behind. So that's it. That's the whistle-stop tour of the project. Thank you very much for listening.
Great, thank you, Zoe. Looks like we have a few questions that came in here. I think you answered a few of them during the actual video, so thank you for doing that. So I had a few that were either sent from the chat privately or things like that. But so one question that from Mike Scarla said, are you worried about dermestids and other pests getting into the collection while you wait for the cabinets to arrive and be installed?
Yes. Yes, but we don't really have a choice. So we've just got to keep an eye on the collections and hope that everything works out okay. The room that most of them are stored in, luckily, has very low pest incidence. So we're in a good position, or at least as good a position as we can be, all things considered.
Yeah. Gisela de la Cadena asks, exciting project. How many countries are involved? How can you participate / collaborate?
So we, the collections themselves are the British collection. So that's England, Wales, Scotland, and it's all the material that we own from those 3 countries. We are just starting a new phase of participation, actually. So one of the big exciting things we've got coming up is trying to get younger participants, young adults, so we're talking A-level students in the UK, which are about 17 or 18, to do a sort of meet the scientist, meet an entomologist, get interested in insects. So we're going to be putting a call out for people to help us with that soon. It's quite an exciting piece of work coming up.
If I could ask one really quick question, you mentioned a lottery funding connection. How did you get a lottery money funded for the collections?
So the lottery within the UK has to give a portion of the money that is raised to charity. So you can apply for a grant through various different funding streams. It's quite difficult. It's very competitive, and it takes a really long time. So I think we now are a year into delivery, but this project from initial conception is 7.5 years in the making.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a lot of time. All right. Thank you, Zoe. I think that's all the time we have for live answered questions. If you have any more questions, please put them in the Q&A box and Zoe will get to them, or you can put them in the shared notes document. So our next speaker is Michael Sfarla. He's going to be talking about murder hornets.
Thank you for tuning into this recorded talk. Today I'll be discussing the murder hornet panic and COVID-19 and how those 2 events have impacted the insect identification labs at Penn State and North Carolina State. So Asian giant hornets are native to Asia, in Japan and Korea and China, all the way west into India. We're worried about them primarily because they predate honeybees, specifically when they attack Western honeybees, which are the species that are used for commercial honey production and commercial pollination services. That species doesn't have any innate defenses against the hornets. And so 30 Asian giant hornets can wipe out a colony of 30 to 50,000 honeybees in just a matter of hours. It's a really big issue for beekeepers. There's some worry that if Asian giant hornets were introduced to North America, they could establish and spread. And there's some precedent for this. European hornets, Vespa craba, were introduced in the 1840s in the eastern United States and have since spread throughout most of eastern North America. The public has been aware of Asian giant hornets for some time now, mostly due to viral videos shared through social media. So, for example, here is a 2011 video that was posted by National Geographic on YouTube, Hornets from Hell, that has gathered 4.5 million views in that time. Another video posted in 2012 to YouTube, 30 Japanese giant hornets kill 30,000 honeybees, was viewed 9.2 million times. Asian giant hornets have even made the mainstream broadcast news. So here's a story that was run by ABC News, tracking giant hornets that have killed at least 42 people in 2013. You notice the one thing about all of these headlines is they're all really sensationalist and scare the public. And it garnered so much public attention that in 2015, Matt Bertone, my co-author, wrote this blog post for North Carolina State. Are Asian or Japanese giant hornets in North Carolina? Because so many people were contacting him worried about Asian giant hornets. And since then, this blog post has been extremely popular. Every summer, it gets between 6,000 and 7,000 views. So this is something that people are worried about and looking on the internet for information about. In 2019, September and October, Asian giant hornet workers were found in British Columbia and Washington State. The nest that was found in British Columbia was eradicated, but this didn't really seem to make the national news. I, even as an entomologist, didn't hear that they had been found here. It wasn't until the New York Times posted this story on the 2nd of May of this year, murder hornets in the U.S., the rush to stop the Asian giant hornet, that I'd even known that they'd been found in North America. This story dropped on a Saturday, and I saw a bunch of entomologists talking about it on Twitter, and I thought as soon as I saw the headline with murder hornets, that my inbox was just going to blow up when I got back to work on Monday. Just to put into perspective exactly what happened, here's a graph of the number of identification requests I've gotten per month for the last 3 years. You can see it's a nice bell curve. I get fewer requests in the winter, more requests in the summer, about what you'd expect for an insect ID lab that is dealing with insects. They're out and about in the summer. So the first 3 months of this year were pretty on par for what you would expect. The COVID shutdown hit central Pennsylvania in late March. So I didn't really see much of an effect of it. It did shut down all the county offices, so they stopped accepting ID requests from the public. And so in April, I saw a real big dip in the number of requests I got because I wasn't getting any physical samples in through the extension offices. And then the New York Times story dropped, and the number of ID requests I got shot through the roof. It actually stayed really high throughout the rest of the summer until September, until they finally dropped back down to normal levels. So we'll slide that graph off to the left. What was Matt seeing in North Carolina? Kind of similar. He also saw a really big spike in May, probably attributed to this New York Times story, but for him, his ID requests quickly dropped back down to what are pretty normal levels for that time of year. So what's going on? Why the difference? So first of all, neither of us got any actual Asian giant hornets. You probably would have heard about it if these things were found in the eastern U.S. So what was the public seeing? So here's the Asian giant hornet related requests broken down by species for both labs. So this big blue one, this main species that most people are mistaking for Asian giant hornet was, as you probably would have guessed, European hornet. It's about the same size. It's a big Vespa species, looks kind of similar, kind of colored similar. A lot of people didn't know that they're in the eastern U.S., and so that's driving the bulk of these misidentifications. The next most misidentified species was eastern cicada killers. And then finally, southern yellowjackets actually drove a not insignificant proportion of the identification requests, in part because the queens are facultative nest parasites of other yellowjackets. And so southern yellowjacket queens are about twice the size as other yellowjacket species because they have to go in and overpower and kill the queen of the host nest. So people see these and think they're too big to be yellowjackets. What is it? Is it an Asian giant hornet? And then there was a smattering of other species that made up the rest of the IDs. So what were some of these other species? Both Matt and I got pigeon horntails, other vespids, other large wasps, so a couple of sex species in particular, and elm sawfly. I got a number of requests for Dialis tolteca, this large scaleid wasp from California and out west, as well as yellowjacket hoverfly, red-legged cannibal fly, this really large acylid robber fly, and even one request, somebody asking if a bumblebee was an Asian giant hornet. And then two that were kind of further afield. I got one request for a Jerusalem cricket, and Matt got a request for a cicada asking if these were Asian giant hornets. So the rest of the talk, I'm going to be using blue for European hornets, red for eastern cicada killers, green for southern yellowjackets, and purple for everything else. So was there any seasonality to what we were seeing? As you probably could have guessed, there was. There was a big spike in European hornet requests in May, right after the story dropped. A smaller but not insignificant spike in the number of requests for southern yellowjackets. Those died off throughout the summer as the queens started founding nests and weren't out as frequently. And then as eastern cicada killers came out and became active, people started seeing and sending those in more frequently. If we look at the number of Asian giant hornet related requests as a percent of the total requests, you can see in both labs in May, Asian giant hornet related requests made up a significant portion of the total requests, but that actually in both labs fell off fairly quickly. In June and July and August, Asian giant hornet related requests didn't make up nearly as large a proportion as I might have guessed. And actually it's all other specimens, all non-Asian giant hornet related things that are driving the ID requests in the labs for the rest of the summer. So what does this look like compared to years past? So here it is at Penn State. You can see in May, the number of all other requests. If Asian giant hornets hadn't happened, we probably would have continued to see a drop in requests due to COVID. But Asian giant hornets and European hornets in particular made up for that drop. But then after that, in June, July, and August, all other specimens or all other species jumped up beyond levels I've never seen at Penn State before. And I think part of what's driving this is people are just outside more. They're bored. There's still partial lockdowns. People don't want to go out because they're scared of COVID. So they're around their houses more. They're in their yards. They're seeing more insects out and about, and they just want to know what they are. Similarly, in North Carolina, Matt saw a really big spike in May due to primarily European hornets, but then quickly settled down to what would be like standard numbers for a normal year, even accounting for worry about Asian giant hornets. And this is actually reflected in some of the educational outreach material that we put out. So here is that blog post again that Matt made back in 2015. So if we look through the rest of 2020, see a really big spike, dramatic spike, over 15,000 views right around May, and then it quickly drops off. I wrote a fact sheet for Penn State, published about mid-May. We have 19,500 views throughout since it's been published, and you can see vast majority, almost 15,000 of those views happened in May, and then it quickly drops off. People are less interested in it. So what's going on now? Asian giant hornets are back in the news. There was a nest found in Washington and destroyed, so now that they're back in the news, will there be a second spike in requests? Who knows? You'll just have to stay tuned.
Thank you, Michael. That was excellent. So I wanted to do a quick interactive thing here before Mike answers questions. Put a +1 in the chat if you've had to help identify something someone thought was an Asian giant hornet in the U.S. All right, there we go. Yeah, they're flooding in. So I had a personal question, and then there was a couple in the chat, if I remember right. Oh yeah, there we go. We're doing an actual poll. So quick answer that if you can. One question I had was how many of these specimens were photo requests versus actual specimens, and what percentage of the ones you received did you archive, or were most of them photos?
I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I'd guess 90% of what I got were photos.
Okay.
Mostly because, again, the extension offices were shut down. I did get some people mailing stuff through the mail themselves, but almost all of my ID requests switched to virtual, even excluding Asian giant hornets. I've got the numbers, and one thing I do want to plug here, I guess, is that Matt and I are planning on writing this up into an American Entomologist article. So if any of you other identifiers or anybody else that's got like databases of what has come in, if you want to share that and be an author on this, please reach out, and we can do the same thing with your data that we're doing this. I'd be really curious to see what's going on the West Coast with miss IDs.
Yes, related to that, David Serrano asks, any new pest records from the onslaught? Was there anything that was like a new record or something like that?
Not that I've seen. I had a bunch of slides that I cut. I got IDs from almost every state in the U.S., but everywhere I was getting European hornets from, it's from within the known range. So it's not like we expanded the range on that species or anything.
Laura Parturis asks, did most of these requests come from honeybee keepers, or folks you think were just spending more time outside?
Almost none of them came from honeybee keepers. I did have maybe half a dozen people that emailed specifically worried about the impact of Asian giant hornets on honeybees, but that was about it.
Gotcha. All right, thank you, Michael. All right, so if I think there's 2 or 3 more questions in the Q&A if you want to answer those. But we're going to move on to our next speaker, our very own Chris Grinter, coming to you from San Francisco.
Hi, I'm Chris Grinter, Collection Manager of Entomology at the California Academy of Sciences and President of ECN. So we were one of the first institutions to close in the US and one of the very last to open. There's an asterisk because undoubtedly I'm sure there's someone that has opened up after we have, but as far as I know, we were one of the longest closed institutions, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've maintained our collections over this time. So I'll talk about a history of our closures, the timeline of our shutdown, and some of the problems and lessons that we learned during this process. San Francisco is not a stranger to disaster and closure. This is the 1906 earthquake, which was roughly a 7.8 magnitude that crumbled large parts of the city, and a subsequent fire came through and burned 80% of the city. The Academy, of course, was completely destroyed in this process. This is the interior of the building in 1906 after the atrium collapsed and the bridge collapsed. There was a walkway that joined the front of the building to the back, and that part collapsed. The fire came through that afternoon and destroyed the building and most of the collections, but Alice Eastwood was able to run into the crumbling building and save hundreds of our type specimens, as well as a lot of our documents and manuscripts and really important founding ledgers that were critical to save. 1918 was the first pandemic that shut the Academy down. This is only 2 years after the Academy reopened from the earthquake, which we located to our spot in Golden Gate Park, which is our present day location. The pandemic shut us down for 29 days, which was a pretty fast closure considering today, but the pandemic was much deadlier in 1918. So we're thankful at least for modern health and safety protocols today that's kept us closed and kept everyone safer. This is the current timeline of our shutdown today. So if you notice, back in January 25th, our Academy Incident Command was activated due to news coming out of China. They began at that point a process that fell into place over the last 7 months of what it would look like closing the Academy, how long it would stay closed, and what we would do over those months. The city of San Francisco declared a state of emergency on February 26th, and so we really began thinking about what's going to happen at that time. March 13th was the day that the Academy was closed to the public. And this was the day that the science collections got together for one of the first times and really started planning what we had to do to prepare for this. And you'll notice that we closed to all of the staff only a few days later on the 16th. So our plan only had a few days to really get into place. Then finally, we were able to open on October 13th, and I'll talk a little more about that towards the end of our presentation. So what we did on the 13th, the collection managers met and walked through every single collection room. We have a lot of rooms that require special care or special attention. This is the Galapagos tortoise room. We have over 400 tortoises in this room. It has a dehumidifier. The tortoises have arsenic on them. We have to make sure that everything's in good condition during the shutdown. So we highlighted a lot of those areas or rooms of special concern. We also updated a phone tree and created an emergency response plan. We didn't really have a response plan in place for that prolonged shutdown or a pandemic like this. And even today, it's a rough document that's still evolving. We also created an emergency access calendar on Google Drives. This calendar was accessible to the collection managers and some of our chiefs in building security, so they were aware of who was coming in on what day to do our safety walkthroughs. We had one collection manager walk through every single room in the building, every single collection room in the building, 5 days a week, and occasionally 7, depending on what was happening. And we also had to build a strategy of how to deal with unfamiliar equipment. This is someone learning how to use one of our liquid nitrogen dewars, which takes a little more care and attention. The impacts to the department were fairly severe. We had 2 people furloughed, but we were able to bring them back to full-time by October a few weeks ago. They're on grant funding right now. And we also had one person take a voluntary retirement, which was fantastic for that person, but that position hasn't yet been filled and will be vacant until we can rehire or have that hiring freeze lifted. Our budget for shipping loans was severely impacted, so we're not able to ship most international loans this year, this fiscal year up through July. So potentially, if you've requested material from us recently, it might be a little while before we can get it to you. Most of our US loans are going to be processed, but we have restricted access to the building. So today I only have about 25% access, which gives me 2 to 3 days, depending on the schedule or the week and how many people are in. We have no visitors or volunteers on site, which is really tough because we rely heavily on our volunteer corps, and we have a lot of visitors that come through the collection. So there's going to be a large queue of people waiting to come when we reopen. We've had 55 loan and data requests since March, and only about 22 of them have been filled today. And we have dozens and dozens of loans that have been coming back that are awaiting our staff to get them back into the collections, but they're frozen and they're in the collection room waiting for processing. So our new building, which is amazing and opened in 2008, helps most of the time. There are always problems. Even though we have a new building, we have some rodents. And the good news is that no one in the building really helped us control the rodent population. Our pest contractor was able to be on the whole time during the closure. And if anything, we really upped the intensity of our rodent trapping, and we knocked back the rodents in the building by a huge percentage, to the point where we can really work on excluding them and making sure they're not in our front of house or some of our back of house spaces. We've never had them in the collection spaces, but we're able to knock back the population in the building because people aren't dropping pizza all over the place. Closed moths, however, really loved the dark closed building. We had an outbreak in some of our office spaces, which then bled over into one of the collection rooms, which was a mammalogy oversized taxidermy room, which was a real challenge to control. And it took several months of working, steadily freezing and treating large oversized antlers and heads just to get a handle of that closed moth problem. And for the most part, we've completely eradicated them in collection spaces now, so that's good. The one problem that we really didn't see coming was contractors. We didn't know that there were going to be a lot of contractors all over the building, and they were everywhere, and they were in our collection rooms, and they would leave doors ajar, they would leave equipment out when they thought no one was behind them, and they would shut the lights off without telling us in the middle of the day, because electrical thought they could do that without notifying anyone. So there was a curve that took a few days to really get back to functioning, establishing the communication, making sure doors got closed. But this was one of the things that collection managers had to do every day, was check to make sure that everything was safely secured every night. There were some minor problems with equipment. We had an ice machine backup in the freezer room, but that was easily resolved. We had one of our water dispensers back up or malfunction and leak. Easily fixed, but we had to be there every day to check to make sure these things weren't a bigger problem. So today, the public health order is still in effect in San Francisco. We are still working from home most of the time. So I'm only in about 25 to 33% of the time, and I have other staff that are only in 1 or 2 days a week. So it's very hard to be catching up on the backlog that's built up over the last few months. But what did we do at home over the last 8 months? We fortunately had a really great photograph database of our type specimens and a lot of their labels. So we were able to database and georeference thousands of those labels from home, which finally allowed us to catch up on this backlog, which was absolutely a benefit to this. And it was a great time to start evaluating new databases. So we were able to get some of our data uploaded to TaxonWorks, and I've been testing that and working with the TaxonWorks team towards moving towards this new database. If you're around for one of their late night with TaxonWorks sessions, meet and greets, I encourage you to go. It'll be very interesting to talk to them. We also had some fun outreach opportunities. Breakfast Club at the Academy was a really interactive virtual tour series that we've run in mornings. We were trying to do one a month, a tour of a collection. I haven't done entomology yet, but I've had some VIP tours and other special tours that I did behind the scenes. And I'm going to be doing a Breakfast Club in the coming few weeks, where I'll take the public on a live Q&A through the collection and able to show them the specimens and the collections. And it's a lot of fun to interact with the public that way. And of course, we had the Asian Hornet fiasco that happened. I was able to get into the Academy and photograph our specimens for some of the outreach and public events and press releases that we did, urging people not to panic. And then we finally reopened on October 13th. So this is Dr. Bennett masking up our T-Rex up front and make sure people are encouraged and reminded to keep their masks on. But the priority was really for paid staff and postdocs and students that were here on a timeline. So we got them back in as soon as we could. And then hopefully we can have visiting researchers return after the new year. We'll have to wait and see how the COVID numbers do, but TBD. And finally, I just want to wrap up and acknowledge the collection management team here who worked really hard through this closure to keep everything running. And Entomology has been very patient, working from home, trying to Zoom meet with everyone and coordinate. Our librarian also helped source some of these awesome images, and the board of ECN, which has put together a fantastic meeting this year. And absolutely last, I want to acknowledge the Academy, of course, sits on unceded lands of the Ohlone people. And we are looking forward to working more with the Native peoples moving forward. And hopefully I have time for a question too. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Please ask your questions for Chris in the Q&A feature. And I have a question while we're waiting for those to come in. Were you able to get any of the volunteers or other sort of like temp workers able back in at all, or have you mostly just been focusing on the paid workers in the collection?
Yeah, for right now, we're focusing only on the paid workers. We have hopes to get the volunteers back in the next few months, but the number of paid workers and students and postdocs that we have, there's pretty much only enough room for them at the moment, at least until we can get a little higher capacity.
Right. Was there any testing involved in getting access back to the collection, or is California not really at that phase yet?
We have pretty good testing in the city, but we haven't been testing specifically for Academy access. I do miss Illinois and seeing how on top of it they are on campus and testing everyone all the time. But the numbers in San Francisco are actually fairly low.
Yeah.
We've been really rigorous about mask wearing. Everyone is very compliant with that. Generally, we're doing really well. We're able to keep things open because of that.
Great. Rachel Osborne asks, what initiatives are you working on with the indigenous people local to you?
Our new executive director of the Academy, Dr. Scott Sampson, is working a lot with local indigenous peoples and tribes because we haven't had an amazing relationship with them in the past, or just haven't considered it. And so that's something that we're really working on catching up with and ensuring that they are part of the decisions that we're making as the Academy. And you know, another thing too, we have a lot of California collections in our anthropology holdings. Those collections are always open to the people of those that the collections belong to, but that's about all we do right now. And so we can do a whole lot better than that.
I think we have time for this last quick question. Ethan Estabrook asks, do you use pheromone traps to help monitor webbing, clothes, moth pest activity? That was pretty scary.
Yeah, we do. And for the most part, we just know they're everywhere because our public floor is very open. So we have a lot of glass doors where it has enough clearance to the outside park that a mouse can run under them. So that's been a terrible problem we've actually been working on fixing this year, over 10 years now since we opened, finally fixing the exterior doors. So the mice have just kind of been everywhere. If we put a pheromone trap out, we'll get some closed moths. And you know, the closed moths are linked to the rodents that are nesting all over the place. So we've really cleared up the public floor in the last few years. And then the closed moths behind the scenes, we've mostly eradicated too. So it's been a battle, but mostly solved now. Great.
All right, thank you, Chris. Any other questions, please ask those in the Q&A, and Chris can answer those on his own time. Next, we have Karen Wright from Texas A&M, and she'll be talking about her experience during COVID.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. And today I'm going to talk about maintaining productivity during a pandemic. And that's not to say that I have all the answers, quite the contrary, but I figure if we all share our experiences, maybe we can learn from each other. Each of us is in a different position depending on what country you're in or what state you're in, or even local laws. So we're all in a different situation, but maybe if we share all of our experiences, we can help learn and stay productive. Just some very brief background on the Texas A&M University insect collection. We've got just about 3 million specimens that we know of, and our main goal for the past 10 years has been to digitize all of these records. Right now we're not quite to the halfway mark, but almost all of our digitization efforts have been funded by NSF. Earlier, before my tenure at Texas A&M, there were 2 TCNs, the SCAN TCN and the Tritrophic TCN, that really helped with our digitization efforts, and they were just about ending when I started working here in 2016. Since then, we've been lucky enough to be awarded 2 more NSF grants. One is CSBR grant to rehouse our entire ethanol collection. But nowadays, CSBR grants also require that digitization be a part of that workflow. So we're digitizing our specimens as we rehouse them. And then just recently, we've been lucky enough to be a part of the Terrestrial Parasite Tracker, TCN. So this graph just goes back 3 years, not our entire data entry time period. But in 2018, this is what it looks like when we don't have any external funding to digitization. So we kind of hover around 2,000 records or so per month. And then in December 2018, we were awarded our ethanol grant to rehouse our ethanol collection. But it took me almost 6 months just to ramp up on that and really get the infrastructure down, all the cabinets and jars and ethanol and vials arranged. So we're just ramping up on data entry efforts in that when the TPT grant started in September 2019. And then these two combined, you can really see that we were finally making some really good progress on data entry. And then of course, COVID hit in March. Well, it hit earlier than that, but it didn't affect Texas until about March when they told us all to go home. So I'm just going to go through briefly our three main things that we work on for digitization. First, and the most traditional one, is our pinned collection. This came to a full stop when they told us to go home. But after that, as COVID levels started to rise in Texas, we had more and more people being allowed to come back to campus as well, including undergraduate workers. So I have had to reduce my number of workspaces. I know you guys are probably mostly familiar with university systems, spaces that are more like rat dens than they are big laboratories. So they're really crammed in there. So I'm down to just 3 workspaces. I've compensated a little bit with this with some pretty tight scheduling of different undergraduates coming in at different hours. And then I've assigned each of them their own personal scanner, keyboard, and mouse that they put away at the end of their shift before wiping down the surfaces. But other than that, there's been no change in our pinned collection workflow, just a little bit slower, fewer workers, and that sort of thing. Our ethanol collection is a little bit different. We've been able to make this partially remote work. So our biggest goal here is to move away from these vial racks and the individual vials with the old school neoprene stoppers into our fancy new cabinets and our fancy new jar system. So we have been limited here as well. We used to have 2 workspaces, now we're down to 1. But with an expansion into non-standard hours and really tight scheduling, we've been able to keep this room occupied by a single person at a time from 7 a.m. till 7 p.m. on work days, and even some shifts on the weekends. So we're keeping this room as busy as possible. And as these students go through these vials, they're producing work for the students at home to work on. So our workflow here is that the students will empty out 10 vials at a time into 10 different individual bowls. They add a barcode label to each one of those. And then we've adopted using these stereo slide archival organizers with 10 pockets in each one to do our imagery of those labels. So the students will put all the labels from a vial into the first pocket, as well as a barcode, the accepted scientific name that may differ from the name on the determination label, and then the number of specimens and their life stage. So this first one has 3 larvae in it, and this last one, number 10, has 2 adults in it. And then they flip these slide protectors over onto the flatbed scanners and make a PDF. And then after all that, they rehouse the specimens into our nice fancy new jars. Our slides, however, we've been able to make fully remotely. I know that some people are a little worried about sending specimens home. This is River Martinez, and they're one of my most trusty employees. So River has brought home portions of the slide collection at a time. And the first thing they do is to clean the slides and affix the barcodes. And I have discovered that magic erasers are a great way to get fingerprints off of slides before you affix the barcodes. And then we were going to use the fancy things that Jen Zaspel's group came up with for imaging the slides, but we found that our slide trays in our new slide cabinets are in a perfect format for imagery anyway. So instead of taking a PDF, we use a 35mm SLR camera to make a JPEG of the entire tray that then can go into our Google Drive system and go to workers working from home remotely for the data entry. So we have two forms of data entry then. We have the slides that are JPEGs and the ethanol vial labels that are in JPEGs. And the only new requirement that students now have to have in order to do this from home is they have to have 2 monitors. And that doesn't mean that they all have to go out and buy fancy dual monitors. They've gotten really creative with this. Some students use their laptop and an iPad or a tablet. Some students have even rigged up their TV monitors to look at the images while doing data entry on their other computer screen. That way they don't have to switch between screens, which can lead to errors. So we've been able to continue progress. I have 10 students working on campus and 20 students doing data entry at home. But after a while, I realized that there were a lot of errors accumulating in the data. And this was sort of because of the out of sight, out of mind thing. You can't just look over somebody's shoulder correcting errors as students go along. You really need to keep an eye on this remotely. And so I've ended up training 2 additional employees and taken them off of data entry to just do quality control, where they compare the imagery to the database and make sure that all of the data is being transcribed properly. When it's not, we can always contact the students, individual students that are making those errors, and correct them for future work. Another thing that I've found difficult is assessing how much progress we're making, and I'm in the process right now of making automatic reports that will be generated so that I can assess individual employees' work and project progress remotely. Training remotely is another whole thing. I know Zoom share screen has worked pretty well with that. We've learned a lot of lessons here that I need more automated assessment tools, but we've come up with some new innovations, and a lot of work can be done really efficiently remotely. So stay safe. Thank you to all the people involved in the TCNs, iDigBio, and NSF for all of the knowledge that you've given to me to help things go smoothly. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, Karen. That was excellent. I'm noticing a lot of similarities for what you've been doing versus what I've been doing. So one question that's come in the Q&A is, where did you source your excellent slide drawers?
Yes, so I wish I could remember the name of it off the top of my head. They come in cabinets that fit, I believe it's 6,000 slides each cabinet, and they come with the drawers. And I forget the name of it off the top of my head. It starts with an E, but I'll find out in just a minute.
Looks like, was it Eberbach?
Yes, that's it.
That's it. There it is. Someone else, Ainsley, provided that in the chat. Thank you,
Yeah.
Ainsley. I had a question of my own. And I've had similar experiences during the pandemic. What's been your experience in managing all the students and all your hourly workers during the pandemic? How much time are are you managing people versus like doing collections work yourself from home or in the few times you're allowed back into the collection?
Well, I think that was a difficult lesson for me to learn. You know, when it first started happening, we were just gung-ho on getting everybody working remotely from home to keep the ball rolling. And it wasn't until a few months after that that I started to realize that way more errors were piling up in our data, and the quality control was really a much worse issue than it was when the students were there on campus, when they could be trained in person, when I could just look over their shoulder and correct them one at a time and really spend one-on-one time training students. So this quality control issue really, it caught me off guard, and I wasn't expecting it. So I've taken two of my best, most long-term students and dedicated them. They don't do any more data entry themselves. All they do is compare the original imagery to what ends up in the database of other students. And then they report to me what types of errors are being made, and in some cases, who is making those errors, so that I can, you know, retrain remotely to individual students.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Like that feedback is really important. Seeing what errors are being made and then retraining. I had to do that a couple different times. We're heading towards a break here, but someone just asked another question that I think goes right alongside that. Laura Porturis asks, can you elaborate on how you train new students to handle specimens and digitization workflows while maintaining social distancing, given that it is such a hands-on activity?
So a lot of that was, again, more managerial work on my end. I've been incredibly strict that students show up only during the hours that they've said they're going to show up. They do not come in whenever they want to. It was really relaxed before this whole COVID thing. Students could come in and put time in anytime there was an open computer monitor. But now we have an incredibly strict schedule, and the students are expected to stick with it through the entire semester. And then we'll redesign the schedule over the holidays and then redesign it again next semester. But I have it set up so that each student has certain hours and they're assigned to a particular workstation so that there's no overlap. I have had to go in quite a few times and remind students that 6 feet meant 6 feet. But other than that, it's worked out fairly well. They know how important it is, because if they don't do their job on campus, then my 20 employees working remotely don't have any work to do and they lose their jobs. So if we get a bottleneck on campus, it affects a lot of people. So they've been pretty dedicated.
Yeah. All right, so we're heading to a break here, and I want to be respectful of people's time. There are a couple more questions in the chat there, Karen, if you want to answer those. And I do, before we officially go to break here, I want to just remind everyone that you can share other stories about your pandemic experiences at this link here that I just put in the chat. There's been a few good ones. That people have been sharing, some interesting things that are happening. And it doesn't have to be funny stories or anything like that. It can be like things you lost or other things like that. I think that'll really help us come together as a community. So use that link, share your stories. I encourage you to do that. And it looks like the moderators just put a poll in the chat as well. So please do that during the break. But we're going to a break right now, and we will be back at the UTC 2040 in 9 minutes about. So in 10 minutes. So we will be back soon. Get some coffee. All right, welcome back everyone from break. Hope you all got something refreshing of some sort. Our next speaker, we're just going to keep on going here. Our next speaker is Floyd Shockley from the Smithsonian.
I want to thank the symposium organizers for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today about the unique challenges related to the pandemic closure of the National Museum of Natural History and how we're working to keep our people safe as we prepare to return post-COVID safely. So like many other museums, the Smithsonian, including Natural History, closed to the public on March 14th, 2020. It closed to staff about 4 days later. As of today, November 9th, NMNH has been closed for 240 days, making this the longest closure in the history of the institution. With that closure came no physical access to collections. Most staff are restricted from coming in. Most staff are prohibited from accessing the collections themselves, even for service requests. And largely, staff have been forced to pivot to work on digital projects and data enhancement during the shutdown, which is relatively new for us and required a lot of additional work to get everybody up and telework ready really quickly. So originally, the Smithsonian Institution was trying to manage the shutdowns and reopenings of the museum as a whole, but quickly moved away from that because of major differences in public health numbers across the 7 states, plus DC, and 2 countries where we have facilities. Just as a reminder, all told, we have 20 museums, 11 on the National Mall, an additional 6 inside DC, as well as 3 more outside of DC, 12 gardens, 9 research centers, and 3 cultural centers. What you see here is more or less the framework for reopening that has sort of guided the decision-making process on which museums will be allowed to open. And most of the units, the museums themselves, are using a modified version of this model to plan for their own individual reopenings. So every museum is working on a 4-phase reopening plan. I should point out that 9 Smithsonian facilities have already reopened to the public in a limited capacity, but none have moved past phase 2. And in fact, 2, our field station in Florida and STRI in Panama are still at essential staff only, phase 1. So one of the complicating factors for natural history staff is that they come from lots of different places. So many of our staff live in other states, 5 other states, and commute in. But the majority of our staff are, in fact, from the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area. Natural history doesn't just include our downtown museum, but it also includes our off-site museum support center and Garber facility out in Suitland, Maryland, and the Smithsonian Marine Station in Fort Pierce, Florida. One of the things that makes it complicated to plan for is public health data is highly variable amongst all of the places where we have staff. And so it's not a one-size-fits-all model. We have to be very careful, and we have to take into account state restrictions where people live versus the District of Columbia where the museum is located. In terms of our staff, one of the other things that makes us complicated is we're just so large, and not in terms of our collections, though we are that too, but we have 450 permanent federal and trust staff on site most of the time, plus an additional 150 or so staff from centrally organized units of the Smithsonian that are assigned to natural history. So these are things like IT, building and custodial services and so on, and security. Then we have lots of affiliates, fellows, interns, contractors, and volunteers. So all told, we have about 1,000 people potentially on site in any given day pre-COVID. In addition, we have large visitorship, one of the largest within the Smithsonian at 5 million visitors per year. So that means that we have to think very carefully about how we can make both the exhibit spaces as well as the behind the scenes spaces safe for both our visitors as well as our staff. Part of that has already been implemented with additional features being added to security booths, as well as changing the occupancy levels for passenger and freight elevators in the building. One-way stairwells. So far, we haven't moved to one-way hallways, but that has certainly been considered. Masks are required within any Smithsonian facility, including natural history. The only place that you're allowed to take your mask off within the building is in your office specifically. Any other time that you leave your office or interact with another individual in the building, you must be wearing masks. Failure to do so could result in losing your access privileges. In addition, the cleaning crew has cleaned most of the museum, focusing initially on the visitor space and then moving behind the scenes, basically a top to bottom cleaning. However, the cleaning stopped at office doors, so individual staff are expected to clean their own spaces whenever they come in and make them safe for a future when additional people will be coming into the building. Those who are granted access are given complimentary masks as well as hand sanitizer, and those are set aside in individually labeled bags so that you don't even have to dig for those supplies. All communal areas, conference rooms, dining areas, shared offices are all closed. You can only work one person in an office at the moment. And all but a select few restrooms have been closed. Part of that is simply we don't have enough facilities staff on site to clean all the bathrooms in the building. This is kind of what the museum looks like now. No visitors, not very much going on out in the exhibit space, and behind the scenes, most of the time there's very little activity except in entomology, which I'll get to in a moment. For those who are interested in exploring the museum, we do have virtual tours. We've brought many of these online since the pandemic began. And so you can explore the Natural History Museum. Unfortunately, there are no behind the scenes tours added to this, but we hope that that might change as restrictions are lifted. So entomology itself is further complicated by the fact that we have collections housed in lots of different places. So we have 11 different locations for our collections. There's the museum downtown, the Museum Support Center, the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center out in Beltsville, Maryland, and then 8 different off-site enhancement partners in 8 different states or provinces in 2 countries. And the thing that makes that complicated is each location has slightly different rules or are at different phases of reopening, and some never actually closed. So allowed activities at the moment, limited research. This is mostly postdoctoral fellows who are working on a time-sensitive project related to grant deadlines or visa deadlines, and it can't be done remotely. We have a few of our USDA staff are in regularly, but at some point or another, most have come in and they're doing urgent identifications only. They're not working on research. We have a few folks who are caring for live collections that are housed inside the department. For my part, I'm doing regular inspections of all the collection spaces, offices, and freezers, as well as making sure that those staff who do come in on either a regular or ad hoc access can get to the materials and supplies they need, and to do so in a contactless way so everyone remains safe. So some of the challenges are probably some of the same challenges that you and your institution are dealing with. For us, one of the biggest ones was that at the beginning of the pandemic, DC, Maryland, Virginia had a coordinated COVID response. But as time has passed, they've diverged. So now there's 3 different restriction and reopening plans to follow, depending on where you live. Mass transit's also an issue, not just because of cleaning, but also because of limited schedules. And of course, those staff with school-aged children are wrestling with multiple challenges related to scheduling, in-person versus hybrid versus all remote, and how to deal with managing all of that with a 2 working parent household. In addition to our 8 scientific staff, many of our facilities and housekeeping and security staff also identify as high risk based on one or more of the CDC categories. And so that means that those staff are limited. And when those staff are limited, it puts a strain on resources for everyone else. In addition, we have got a lot of affiliated agency staff and other non-SI staff in the building. And so it's important that we kind of balance their needs because they're in a different stage of reopening or have mission critical work that has to continue whether there's a pandemic or not. And then finally, the fact that the museum administration made the difficult decision to not allow specimens to leave the building put a lot of research delays in place, but that was it couldn't be helped because of unknown risks associated with doing so. Other challenges, we've had very strict travel restrictions, so there's been no field work, no research in the on-site collections, and no collection retrievals. So our phased reopening looks more or less like this. We were in a phase 0 essential personnel only from March until July. From July to September, we moved into phase 1 where they basically added a number of research fellows with those time-sensitive issues I mentioned. Phase 2, we started in September and we're still in phase 2. That adds a small number of additional staff, but it's still less than 100 individuals across all departments, including facilities and security staff. So it's still really low census at the moment. And we have no idea when phases 3 and 4 will begin or end. We do know that we're likely going to move to reopen to the public in a limited capacity in phase 3 with timed entry to control density and allow physical distancing. Staff will continue to telework mostly in phase 3, but the good news is we will be able to resume some collection activities, including service requests. But I ask that you be patient because over the course of the pandemic, the queue has gotten quite large. So we'll be doing those as quickly as we can and in the order in which we receive. So most staff will not return until phase 4 or after. Research visitors are still prohibited and will be prohibited for quite some time. And our loan program is going to continue to remain closed for requests until 2021, but I can't tell you when in 2021 because there are still many factors that are going to influence that. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time and attention. And if there's time, I'd be happy to take any questions. Thanks for watching.
Thanks, Floyd. I think we have time for one quick question. Louis Nastasi says, I'm a former intern at NMNH, and it was an essential aspect of my undergrad career. Are interns still engaging with the institution? And if so, what strategies are in place to ensure that they are engaged?
That's a really good question. Obviously, volunteers and interns pose a special challenge for us because we wanted to make sure that we kept them engaged. Mostly, we deferred our intern program this summer because we were afraid we weren't going to be able to provide a meaningful experience for our interns. That being said, we did pick up a few interns who are doing remote projects, usually related to data transcription and kinds of things that they can do with data we already had before we closed. And so we're engaging them as much as we can, but we look forward to being able to get our interns back in next summer for some hands-on experience in the collections.
And I know I think we need to move on here, but I also wanted to just allow you to expand on the decision to not take specimens any home. Was that just to you, like the collection managers, or was that all scientific staff?
Oh, that's museum-wide. It was a decision. It was discussed initially amongst the collection managers, but the decision came from the museum executive team because we could not control for risks while the specimens were away. And that includes not just loaned material, so stuff that we don't own, but that's no specimens, even of the things that we do own, can't leave the museum. So,
yeah, there's a lot of concerns about that. All right, thank you, Floyd. If there's any other questions, please ask them in the Q&A session. Our next speaker is Guy Hanley from Northern Plains Entomology.
Hello from North Dakota. My name is Guy Hanley. Thank you for having me present at the ECN virtual meeting 2020, Entomology Collections during a Global Pandemic Symposium. I'd like to just talk about what I've been doing in my private collection and how it will hopefully at some point benefit a museum. My collection was started in 1994, actually started with butterflies, but since then I have donated that collection. So right now I have approximately 14,000 specimens in 80 coleopteran families, and about 80% plus is identified to species. Most species are from North Dakota and are due to my over 10 years of invasive species surveying for the Minot Forestry Department and the North Dakota Department of Agriculture. So within their target groups, they're interested in cerambycids, buprestids, and scolidids, and then a lot of the associated bycatch is being held in this collection. While I was doing my surveying, and I still am doing it, have gotten funding for it, I was at a university that did not hold scientific collections or was interested in holding research collections. So I felt obligated to have this collection. The nearest collection to me is at North Dakota State University in Fargo. The North Dakota State Insect Research Collection is there, but they are a one-man show for the most part, and the amount of material that I was bringing in would probably overwhelm them. So some highlights in my collection: first North Dakota records of Scolitis chevirevi is in here, some of the first records, some of the first Minot records of Japanese beetles, which has shown up in the last couple of years now, and my data has given valuable insight to the forestry department and how to manage that invasive species. I have the first North Dakota records of the carabid genus Redine, which is a species of carabid beetle, flightless, that is inhabiting pocket gopher burrows. I've done lots of pocket gopher burrow collecting with Dr. Robert Gordon, from Professor Emeritus from the Smithsonian Institution, who now lives in North Dakota. So I have a lot of material from those areas. I have extensive coverage of the weevil genus Listrinotus, which I'm currently working on, trying to develop some matrix-based keys for identification of that genus. I am lucky enough to have retained loan privileges from a number of museums to look at type specimens. They've been gracious enough to allow me to continue to do that while I'm searching for work. I also have all known North American species of the scarab genus Serica because I imaged the entire genus for the revision by Dr. Reese Worthington. And so I retained those specimens, all dissected genitalically. And then I have many state records of hysterid species. Several of these shown here on the page are new species for the North Dakota records. So I have a lot of interesting things in this smaller collection, but I think very valuable. North Dakota is historically under-collected, and we're kind of a unique area here because we are smack dab in the middle of the North American continent. So we are as far away from any ocean as you can be in any direction. So we get a kind of a mix of Western species, Eastern species, Northern coniferous forest species, and some Southern strays that actually get into the state. So it's kind of a unique area. I also have full macro imaging capabilities here at home, and a relatively new stereo zoom microscope that was, all this was purchased through a private grant. A person that saw my potential of continuing to do research while I look for employment was gracious enough to provide a grant to keep my endeavors rolling along. This is one of my plates that I've made of Listrinotus horni. It's a female that I'm trying to right now develop keys for. So like many museums, there were neglected areas. 10 plus years of miscellaneous bycatch from my surveying, a bunch of specimens donated by Mr. Ron McPeak, gifted by Mr. Ron McPeak. As you see here, they're carded, but there has been nothing done with them. Some of these were collected in the 70s, and so they have not been touched since, but very important specimens to get eventually into a museum. Dr. Robert Gordon has gifted me lots and lots of material, Aphodiine scarabs, lots of water beetles in his research. So many of these specimens needed pinning, label production, species identification. So along comes the pandemic in North Dakota, semi-lockdown through April, even though we had 100 cases per day of COVID. Now we're up over 1,000. So we're probably heading for another lockdown, probably more severe than the first. And so my personal stopgap work of doing work for people in their homes came to a halt. But of course, unlike larger museums that have people not being able to get into work because of the lockdown, I could continue working on my collection, which was in areas very welcome. So what was I able to accomplish? All of the McPeak material has been prepared and curated. He has had one of the largest scarab collections I've ever seen as a private collection. Those have been donated to museums now, but now I've taken all of those neglected specimens and have gotten them prepared and organized. Dr. Robert Gordon gave me a bunch of Russian coccinellids that were gifted to him long ago. Those have all been labeled, pinned, and identified. And then all of my invasive species survey specimens and the bycatch have been identified and organized. And then I've also gotten a good portion of my larger family holdings digitized in Excel for others to use. My hope is that as I increase the scientific value of this collection, more and more researchers will want to see what I have here. Again, not a huge collection, but very focused in a particular area, other than this exotic stuff, which is great for showing school kids, scout groups, and things like that. Another area that I've been able to explore a little more in areas that I wanted to get to but never have. I've gotten into some new habitats that I have been wanting to get out into but didn't have the time. This was one. An area of very thick scrub brush and trees just over that hillside. It gets extremely thick, but the really interesting thing is that there was a large population of white-tailed deer that live in this area, and of course lots and lots of dung paths. I have flipped more dung in a 100-mile radius over the past 2 decades, and I've thought that I had collected everything possible in that habitat. But I got up into this area, having the time, and came across a species that I had not collected in North Dakota. It was known from North Dakota, but I had not collected it yet. So this is actually Agolinus Lapardus. Got a really nice series of these out of this area. So the unwelcome time provided by the pandemic has greatly benefited my personal collection in organization, identification, going through areas. There are still some areas that are a mess. The hydrophilids I'm still working on. The staphylinids are somewhat of a mess as usual, but those are being worked on, and with another lockdown coming, that may change. So I'm hoping, again, once this collection, when I get to a point to where it's going to be donated to a museum, it will be very valuable for future study. Great thanks to the following that have provided assistance over the years: specimens as gifts or loans, identification expertise, field time. I greatly appreciate their help, and look forward to further work and collaborations with a lot of these folks. And if you have any questions now or comments, please feel free. And I thank you for taking the time to listen to my talk.
Thank you, Guy. That was excellent. It's nice to see a different perspective on the COVID pandemic from a private collection. I noticed you answered some questions in the Q&A already, but I had a question for you. So a lot of us, we've heard this a couple times from other collections and in talking about the pest control they've used during the lockdown and concerns about having specimens at home. As Floyd just mentioned, like they didn't even allow specimens to be taken home, but obviously you must have some sort of pest control strategy at home since it's at home all the time.
Well, the nice thing is that I have a museum studies degree, and I've been well versed in that training, and so I basically keep a very tight IPM protocol here of no food in my collection area, and I've got 60 plus drawers here, and I make sure that they are checked very, very often through all of them. And literally in the 2 decades I've been doing this, I think I've had one instance of something got in. I believe it was dermestids in an area, and that was the only time I've had any trouble, honestly. All of my drawers, I build all my own drawers. They're very tight fitting, and I've had literally no problems. That's the great thing of being here in kind of the Great White North, is there's not a lot of pests that will get into our houses of that type. I really haven't had any issues.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right, thank you, Guy. Any more questions for Guy, please put it in the Q&A feature or in the shared notes document. We have to move on to our next speaker here, Alexandra Sauk, talking about bat bugs and viruses managing ectoparasite collections.
Hi everyone, my name is Alexandra Sauk. I'm a PhD student at the University of Waterloo in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, and I'm here to talk to you about bat bugs and viruses managing ectoparasite collections with at-risk host species. So a little bit about our collection. So our lab has been collecting ectoparasites from bats in Atlantic Canada from 2001 to 2019 and started a new field site in a provincial park in Ontario in 2019. Our collection consists of at least 1,600 vials. These vials are for one ectoparasite species. There could be a number of specimens within the vial depending on how infested the bat was and what kind of sampling was going on at the time. So a lot of our ectoparasite specimens are from opportunistic sampling from the bats. So our lab focuses on bats in particular. My work with the ectoparasites is a little more bat adjacent. But out in the field, we'll have mist nets or heart traps set up to catch the bats. When the bats are processed, when measurements are taken, they're sexed. If they don't have a pit tag, they're implanted with a pit tag. And if there's time, they're checked for ectoparasites. So they're checked on the ears, the wings, and the body and the fur to check for mites and fleas and other ectoparasites. Depending on how many bats are being processed in a night, we'll get more or less sampled for ectoparasites. A little bit about the bats that we collect from. So we have 6 species in Ontario and Atlantic Canada that we've collected ectoparasites from. 3 of which, the little brown myotis, the northern long-eared bat, and silver-haired bat, have been assessed as endangered. A little bit about some of our ectoparasites. So one of them is Spintornix americanus. This is a wing mite in the family Spintornicidae. Fairly common on our bats. Pretty small mite. They're permanent ectoparasites of their hosts. So they complete their life cycle on the bat. They're found from the near Arctic to near tropical regions in North America. Another common one for our bats is Myodopsilus Cygnus the Bad Flea. It's in the family Ichnosipilidae. It's found from Delaware and Nova Scotia, west of Iowa and Alberta. This one's a temporary ectoparasite, so the fleas live in the roost substrate, whether that's a bat box, a tree, or maybe your attic. So the eggs and the larvae will develop in the substrate, and then the adults feed on bats while they're roosting. Another temporary ectoparasite is Simix adjunctus, the eastern bat bug. It's in the family Specimens. So if you've ever seen a bed bug, they look fairly similar. These are also temporary ectoparasites of bats. So the bugs will feed on the bats and then usually just hang out in the roost. These are found from the eastern seaboard to the Rocky Mountains. So the research goals with this collection is to identify the ectoparasite species. So we want to describe any new hosts or locations, and then describe any species that haven't yet been described. There's a lack of ectoparasite research and description in Canada, particularly with mite species. So there's a good chance some of our ectoparasites might be new to these locations. They haven't been found or described there yet. So that's a really exciting part of this research. As well, I'm looking to determine any population genetic structure that might be occurring with these different ectoparasite species, particularly between our permanent and temporary ectoparasites. As well, if there's any associated morphological differences between different genetic populations, I want to look for those. And then compare the bat population structure to that of the ectoparasites to see how much the ectoparasites might be moving around with their hosts. And then COVID-19 happens, which pretty much resulted in us losing a field season. So the University of Waterloo issued a work from home order in mid-March. So the university shut down, can't go into the lab, can't image any of the specimens, can't identify them, can't send them off for sequencing. So that delayed my research by about 6 months. There was also provincial national park closures that happened in Canada that canceled field seasons for a number of my lab mates. So a couple of them were supposed to go to Pine Ridge Provincial Park in Ontario and have a second year of field sampling at that site. Another was supposed to go to PEI National Park in Prince Edward Island. That also got canceled. So my lab mates were unable to continue monitoring and tagging bats in these locations and thus could not collect any ectoparasites to contribute to our collection. Another hurdle that we ran into with COVID-19 was the USGS and the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative issued rulings that limited bat handling. So they restricted all unnecessary bat handling not involving endangered species. If you were handling bats, you needed additional PPE like masks. And once parks reopened, this continued to prevent our return to the field. So the concern here with handling bats was that people would transmit COVID-19 to the bats, which we didn't know how that was going to affect the bats. And a number of our bat species here in North America are already under stress and seeing population declines due to a fungus that causes white nose syndrome. It grows on the wings of the bats while they're hibernating, causes them to wake up, use up their energy stores, and they basically starve during the winter. So we've seen pretty dramatic declines in a number of bat species here. It's also why 3 of those bat species have been assessed as endangered. As well, we didn't want COVID-19 to become a reservoir within our bat species here in North America that could then be retransmitted back to people later on. So there's a lot of caution going on with handling bats this year until we knew the full story of how COVID-19 could be transferred and what the risk would be to these bats. So looking to the future, I've now returned to the school part-time to do lab work, so I'm able to image and identify our ectoparasites. It's really great to get back to the collection. We're hoping for a return to field seasons in 2021 to continue our fieldwork and our bat research and to collect more ectoparasites. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. That was excellent. Always good to hear about ectoparasites. And if you want, there's a poll now to vote on whether you are team bat bug, team fleas, team mites, or team bat. We're going to see whether the invertebrates beat the vertebrates. And I feel like we know what's going to happen there. But a couple questions for you. I think you already answered one in the Q&A. One question I got was, is white nose a problem in Eastern Canada? Are there any changes in ectoparasite load in bats that are infected with white nose versus not infected?
So white nose syndrome is a huge issue in Eastern Canada, and it's part of the reason why my supervisor is now at Waterloo instead of at St. Mary's in Nova Scotia, because his bat populations in Nova Scotia got wiped out by white nose. There is some research that bat ectoparasites could carry the fungus between bats. How much of that is an extra factor in its spread, I'm not sure, because a lot of the ectoparasites to spread between bats, they already have to be pretty close together anyway, especially with the mites. So there's a little bit of concern with the ectos carrying it around, but how much of it's an issue, I'm not sure.
Gotcha. Brittany Harry asks, what is your favorite species so far? And I'm assuming bat, but could be, could be one of the parasites.
I think bat species, my favorite in Canada is the hoary bat. Bat species generally, though, is the Honduran white bat. They're fuzzy and white and have very brightly colored wings. Ectoparasite-wise, I think I'm going to have to go with the bat bug, just because we don't get them very often where we are.
Another question from Erica McAllister. Oh, poll results are in. It looks like Team Batbug wins. Although I did get a comment that it was rude of us to exclude Team Batflies. And speaking of which, Erica McAllister asks, what happened to any Diptera that you've collected? Or
So far with our collection that I've gone through, we don't have any Diptera. There might be a couple in the collection. I just haven't gotten to them yet. They're pretty rare where we are, more popular farther south.
Erica says, wow, no flies? Multiple question marks.
It would be great to get some bad flies. They're pretty awesome.
Yeah, that would be cool. All right. If there's any more questions, please put them in the Q&A feature. That was a great talk. We are heading to a hour-long break here, but we have some sponsor videos from now until about 21:30 UTC, whatever that time zone that is. So we're gonna have some sponsor videos here, and then right afterwards we are going to have a break. And I want to remind you that there is our first meet and greet. The Collections Management Workshop alumni and interested future participants, hosted by Nicole Gunter. Please go to the website, the ECN website, to get access to those. You can get to that from the ECN web link. I'm trying to, yeah, there it goes. Nicole just put it in the chat. Thank you. So go ahead there if you're interested in that, but first stay tuned for our sponsor videos. Thank you to all the panelists and panelists so far.
We're really going to miss seeing you this year in Orlando. But have you ever wondered where your cabinets, drawers, nets come from? Well, wonder no more, because this is BioQuip. I thought maybe you'd like to see what happens when you place an order, see how things are produced, and see how things are shipped. Come on and follow me in. So your order starts here with these wonderful folks. Whether you've ordered online, maybe over the phone, sent us a PO, these are the people you'll talk to. Hey, Selena, do you have anything for me to take to the back? Let's head on over to the tube.
Yes, hello.
Your order, along with some others, are now ready to go back to where the action happens. Meet the tube. Another order coming through, guys. So let's head down to the BioEquip production floor. This is where the magic happens. Quick shout out to the bug room. Oftentimes, before we send something to you, we have to make it. Cabinets, drawers, nets, cages. Welcome to the wood shop. Keep up the good work, Abel. Sometimes we have to do some electrical work too. Traps, black lights. If you've ordered any of those, chances are you've met my good friend Angel before.
Hi.
Once things are produced, they're ready to be shipped out. Let's go see how that happens. Speaking of shipping, your order's here. It's time to get some exercise and fill this order. 2 sprinting boards, check. Box of pins. Everybody needs pins. Time to build a net. Handle, ring, bag, check. Last but not least, 1 drawer, check. It's time to box things up. Elsie, I have another one for you.
Great.
Oh.
Okay, I take it.
Elsie, she's the one who gets it done.
Okay.
Order's boxed up and it's ready to go. All we need to do now is send it off by mail. Oh, hey, now it's time that we got your merchandise off to you. Go put her on the truck, Steve. It's time to bid you farewell from the BioEquip showroom. It's busy in the back, but it's a little quiet up front. Feels a little like Orlando. But with any luck, we'll see you all again next year, 2021, in Denver.